Good evening. Tonight, there is nothing you need to follow closely, nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to understand before you rest. This is a quiet science story, one that can remain in the background while your body does what it already knows how to do. You can listen loosely or not listen at all, and both are completely fine. If at any point your attention drifts away, there is no need to bring it back, because the sound will continue on its own, steady and unchanged. There is no goal here, no moment to wait for, and no part that requires effort. Tonight's story moves slowly, in the same way many natural processes do, without urgency and without any direction you need to track. You may notice the weight of your body where it meets the surface beneath you, the places where nothing needs to be held up, where gravity is already doing the work. Breathing can remain just as it is, with no need to deepen it, slow it, or control it in any way, as air moves in and then moves out again on its own timing. You may begin to notice that even stillness contains quiet movement, small shifts and gentle changes, things happening without effort or awareness. Some movements are obvious, while others happen so gradually that they are only noticeable over long periods of time. There are processes on Earth that continue whether or not anyone is watching them. They do not hurry, they do not pause, and they simply continue. Tonight's science story is about one of those processes, something that has been moving long before humans noticed it, and that will continue moving without needing attention. You do not need to picture anything clearly, and you do not need to imagine scenes or places. If images appear, they can pass by, and if they do not, that is just as fine. This is not a lesson, and it is not a journey you need to stay awake for. It is simply a steady narration, meant to be heard softly and forgotten easily. You are free to rest at any point, because the explanation will not depend on you listening, and the movement it describes will continue, whether you are awake or already drifting. And as the sound carries on, you can allow yourself to do less and less, until eventually there is nothing at all you need to do. As the sound continues, there is no need to adjust your position unless something feels obviously uncomfortable. And if your body has already found a place to rest, you can allow it to stay there. You may notice the simple contact between your body and the surface beneath you, the steady support that does not change, and the way your weight is already being carried without any effort from you. There is nothing you need to hold up, and nothing you need to keep in place. And wherever your body touches, the bed, the chair, or the floor, it can rest fully into that contact. Breathing can remain natural, with no need to guide it, deepen it, or slow it down on purpose, as air moves in and then moves out again, each breath finding its own rhythm without instruction. You may notice brief pauses at the end of an inhale or an exhale, and these pauses do not need to be extended because they happen on their own. If your breathing changes, that is fine, and if it stays exactly the same, that is also fine, because there is nothing to improve. You might begin to notice areas of your body that feel heavier than others, perhaps your shoulders, your arms, or your legs, and you do not need to focus on any specific part. Only notice that heaviness as a sign that effort is slowly decreasing. Muscles do not need to be released deliberately, as they often relax on their own when they are no longer being used. If there are small adjustments, a gentle shift in position, or a deeper breath, they can happen naturally, without planning, as the nervous system responds to the absence of demand and begins to settle when nothing is required. Thoughts may still appear, and that is normal. But they do not need to be followed, as each thought can be treated like background noise, passing through without needing attention. You do not need to solve anything tonight. There is nothing to prepare for and nothing to remember for later, because this time is not for doing and is simply a time where nothing is expected. As the body continues to rest, you may notice subtle internal movements, small shifts in sensation, and quiet changes that happen without announcement. And just as the body breathes on its own, it also adjusts itself on its own, moment by moment. There are systems inside you that are always working, slowly and continuously, without needing awareness, regulating temperature, circulation, and balance, even while you rest. And you do not need to check on them because they function best when they are not observed. And as the sound remains steady and your body remains supported, you can allow attention to become less precise, as it does not need to stay focused or alert. You may notice moments where you are not quite sure what you were just thinking about, and that uncertainty is a sign that effort is fading, with nothing that needs to be corrected. From here, the transition into the science story can happen gradually, without a clear boundary, and without a moment you need to notice, as you continue resting while the narration moves forward on its own. As the body continues to rest, attention does not need to sharpen and can remain loose, almost unfocused, while the narration slowly shifts. There are many processes on Earth that continue quietly in the background. Processes that are not dramatic, do not announce themselves, and do not depend on being noticed. Some of these processes move so slowly that they can feel almost still. Yet over long periods of time, their movement becomes clear. The ocean is one of the places where this kind of movement is always happening. Not in sudden waves or in surface motion you might recognize, but in gradual changes that unfold across great distances. Even when the surface of the water appears calm, the ocean is never truly motionless, as water is always shifting, adjusting, and redistributing itself. Scientists have observed that this movement follows patterns, not rigid paths or exact lines, but gentle tendencies that repeat over time. These patterns are not fast and do not rush from one place to another, instead developing slowly, often taking years or even centuries to complete their full motion. Because this movement is so gradual, it can exist without drawing attention, creating no sound and no visible disturbance, yet playing a steady role in how the planet maintains balance. You do not need to imagine the ocean clearly, and you do not need to picture maps or diagrams, because if any images appear, they can remain vague. This story is not about what the ocean looks like, but about what it does quietly over long periods of time. The water moves not because it is being pushed urgently, but because conditions change slowly, differences accumulate, and small variations add up. And when those differences exist long enough, movement happens naturally, without intention, and without any direction that needs to be followed. This kind of motion does not ask for attention, as it continues whether or not it is understood, and it does not speed up when observed, or stop when ignored. As you remain at rest, the narration will continue describing this movement at the same slow pace, with no need to stay alert, because the explanation will not become sudden or sharp. You can continue listening lightly as the idea of slow ocean movement settles into the background. Over time, scientists needed a way to describe these slow, repeating movements of ocean water, not as events or sudden changes, but as ongoing patterns, and they began to refer to them as ocean currents. This term does not describe a single stream of water, and it does not suggest speed, but is simply a way to talk about how water tends to move when conditions remain consistent over long periods. Ocean currents are not rivers within the sea, and they do not follow fixed channels or have clear beginnings or endings. Instead, they describe tendencies, general directions, and gradual shifts that can only be recognized when observed patiently. Some currents move closer to the surface, while others move far below in regions where light does not reach and where change happens very slowly. These movements are not separate from one another, but are part of a larger system that connects distant parts of the ocean without needing direct contact. Because this motion unfolds over such long timescales, it does not respond to short-term changes and is shaped by conditions that remain stable for years, decades, or longer. Scientists study these patterns not by watching a single moment, but by comparing observations made far apart in time, and when those observations are placed together, movement that once seemed still begins to reveal direction. This way of understanding motion is different from watching something move quickly, as it requires waiting and noticing what remains consistent rather than what changes suddenly. For the purpose of this story, there is no need to remember names, locations, or classifications, because the idea of ocean currents can remain simple. Water moving slowly, responding to conditions over long periods of time. As this idea settles, the narration will gradually move deeper into how these movements form and why they follow certain paths, with no sudden explanations or technical details introduced abruptly, as everything unfolds at the same pace the currents themselves follow. You do not need to stay with each sentence or understand the system as a whole, because the movement continues whether it is followed closely or allowed to fade into the background. And as the sound remains steady, you can continue resting while the science quietly carries on. When scientists talk about ocean currents, they are not describing something fast or forceful, but movement that happens because conditions remain uneven over long periods of time. Water responds to differences in temperature, density, and in how energy is distributed across the planet. And when those differences persist, water slowly adjusts. At the surface of the ocean, one of the most consistent influences comes from the movement of air above it, as wind does not push water as a single mass, but transfers energy gradually, layer by layer. Over time, this energy causes surface water to drift in preferred directions, not in straight lines or at constant speeds, but in broad patterns that repeat. Because the Earth rotates, these surface movements do not travel directly from one point to another, and as water moves over long distances, its path is gently curved. This curvature is not something water experiences directly, but a result of motion occurring on a rotating planet, and over large scales, this effect becomes noticeable. The result is that surface currents tend to follow wide, looping paths rather than crossing the ocean in direct lines. These loops are not closed systems, as they exchange water with surrounding regions slowly and continuously, with nothing sealed and nothing isolated. From above, these patterns can be represented on maps, but those maps are only simplifications, showing tendencies rather than boundaries. In reality, the movement of surface water is always adjusting, influenced by small changes in wind patterns, seasonal shifts, and long-term climate cycles. Yet the overall structure remains stable. The same broad currents continue to appear when observations are compared across many years, And this stability allows scientists to describe surface currents as recognizable features, even though the water itself is always changing. There is no single starting point for a surface current, and no final destination, as water enters and leaves these flows continuously without interruption. The motion does not accelerate toward an endpoint, but simply continues, maintaining balance over time. As this idea settles, it becomes easier to understand that ocean currents are not events, but ongoing adjustments, existing because the planet is never perfectly uniform. And as long as differences remain, movement continues. You do not need to hold on to these details, as they can remain in the background, forming a quiet framework for what comes next. Below the surface, the movement of ocean water changes character, becoming slower, less influenced by short-term conditions, and more dependent on properties within the water itself. Temperature plays an important role here, and so does salinity, as together they affect how dense the water is, with colder water generally being denser than warmer water, and water with higher salinity also being denser than water with lower salinity. When differences in density exist, water slowly rearranges itself, with denser water tending to sink beneath lighter water, not abruptly, but gradually, as part of a continuous adjustment. This process does not happen quickly, and in many parts of the ocean, the movement can take decades or even centuries to complete a full cycle. Because these changes occur so slowly, they are difficult to notice in short observations, and only become clear when measurements are compared over long periods of time. Scientists study this deep movement by observing temperature and salinity profiles at different depths, and by tracking subtle changes across large regions. And what they see is not a single flow, but a broad pattern of sinking and rising water connecting distant parts of the ocean. This deep circulation is sometimes described as part of a global system linking the surface and the depths. But it is important to remember that this description is a model, a way of organizing observations rather than a physical structure. There are no pipes, no channels, and no clear boundaries, because the ocean does not follow a blueprint. Instead, water responds continuously to differences in density, adjusting slowly and redistributing itself over time. Because this movement happens far below the surface, it remains largely unaffected by daily weather or short-term changes, and is shaped by conditions that remain stable for long periods, including patterns of temperature, patterns of salinity, and the overall geometry of the ocean basins. This slow circulation plays a quiet role in distributing heat and nutrients, helping to maintain balance across the planet. Yet it does so without urgency and without any single controlling force. The movement is collective, with each small adjustment contributing to a larger pattern, even though no individual part determines the outcome. As you listen, there is no need to keep track of where the water is going, because the important idea is simply that deep currents exist, moving slowly and continuously, far beyond immediate perception, unfolding at a pace that allows the mind to rest alongside it. When scientists try to describe how surface currents and deep currents connect to one another, they often use simplified models, not to represent physical structures in the ocean, but as tools for understanding patterns that unfold over very long timescales. One such model describes the ocean as part of a large, interconnected circulation system in which water slowly moves at the surface, gradually sinks in certain regions, travels through the deep ocean, and eventually rises again elsewhere. This process does not form a loop that can be traced easily, and it does not return water to its exact starting point, but instead redistributes water across the globe over time. Because this movement takes place over hundreds or thousands of years, it does not respond to short-term events, and storms, seasonal changes, or brief shifts in temperature do not interrupt it. The model helps scientists understand how heat is transferred from one region of the planet to another, and it also helps explain why certain areas of the ocean tend to remain warmer or cooler than others. However, it is important to remember that the ocean itself does not follow instructions or complete cycles because a model describes them, as the real ocean is always adjusting. Water sinks where conditions allow it. Water rises where density decreases. And between those points, movement continues slowly and continuously. No single current controls the system, and no single location determines its direction, as the circulation emerges from countless small adjustments happening at once. Because this movement is so slow, it remains largely invisible to everyday experience, as it cannot be felt directly or seen without instruments. Yet it has been observed repeatedly through measurements collected across many regions and over long periods of time. These observations show that the deep ocean is not isolated from the surface, as energy, heat, and matter are exchanged gradually, linking distant parts of the planet. For the purpose of this story, there is no need to remember the details of this model, as it is enough to know that such a slow global movement exists, a movement that does not hurry, does not pause, and does not depend on attention or awareness. As the narration continues, the focus will remain on this sense of steady background motion, with no sharp transitions or sudden explanations, as everything continues at the same unchanging pace. You do not need to stay alert to follow what comes next, and the ideas can remain present even as attention softens, as at this point, there is no need to stay with the explanation. The movement being described does not require observation in order to continue, as it does not become clearer with more attention, and does not pause when attention fades. You are free to let go at any moment, because ocean currents continue whether they are followed closely or allowed to remain in the background, and their motion does not depend on being understood. The same slow adjustments that move water across the planet will keep happening even as awareness softens. If you find yourself drifting, that is not a problem, and nothing essential will be missed. From here on, there will be no new ideas introduced, and no additional details to track, as the story simply continues along the same steady path. The water keeps moving because conditions remain uneven. Differences in temperature and density continue to exist, and so the adjustments continue. This movement does not accelerate, does not reach a destination, and does not complete a task, but simply maintains balance over long periods of time. You do not need to picture where the water goes next, and you do not need to remember what has already been said, because the explanation does not build toward a conclusion or resolve into an answer, remaining open, continuous, and unfinished. As the narration carries on, the language will remain familiar, and ideas will repeat gently, using slightly different words without adding complexity, as this repetition is intentional and mirrors the way the currents themselves move slowly, revisiting the same regions again and again. Nothing new needs to happen for the movement to continue, and if thoughts appear, they can pass without engagement, while if attention fades, the sound remains steady. You are not expected to listen actively, and you are not expected to stay awake, because the explanation has already done what it needs to do. From here, the narration becomes something you can rest alongside, without effort and without direction. And as the words continue at the same quiet pace, you are free to do less and less, allowing the background motion to carry on by itself. The movement described so far does not need to be followed further, as it continues in the same way it always has, slowly, evenly, and without interruption. Water keeps adjusting to small differences that remain in place, differences of temperature, density, and position. And nothing about this process requires urgency or seeks completion. The ocean does not hurry to restore balance or rush toward equilibrium, but simply responds, moment by moment, over very long spans of time. And this steady response is enough. There is no final state the water is trying to reach, and no ideal arrangement waiting ahead, as the movement exists because conditions exist, and as long as those conditions remain, the movement continues. In this way, the ocean does not behave like a system with a goal, but like a system maintaining itself, where the same gentle adjustments repeat again and again, not because they must, but because nothing stops them. These repetitions do not accumulate into an ending, but simply persist. You do not need to remember where the explanation began, and you do not need to anticipate where it might go next, because the structure remains flat, unchanging, and predictable. As the narration continues, it will keep returning to the same ideas of movement without urgency, change without direction, and adjustment without effort. And this repetition is not meant to add information, but to remove the need to hold on to anything. If you are awake, the words can remain familiar, and if you are drifting, they can fade into sound. And either way, nothing essential changes. The ocean currents continue, whether they are noticed or not, and their slow motion does not depend on awareness. And as this section comes to a close, there is no shift to mark it, and no signal that something new is about to begin, as the narration simply carries on, steady and unchanged, ready to repeat what has already been said in quieter and simpler ways. As the narration continues, the ideas remain familiar, and nothing new needs to be introduced, as the ocean currents still move in the same slow way, responding quietly to differences that remain. Water adjusts because it can, because there is space to move, and because nothing prevents it. And these movements do not seek attention, are not dramatic, and do not announce themselves, but remain part of the background of the planet, present whether they are noticed or not. Over long periods of time, this steady motion helps distribute heat and material across the ocean, not as an active process or directed effort, but as a natural consequence of slow adjustment. Warm regions and cooler regions remain connected, not directly or quickly, but through continuous exchange. And this exchange does not require coordination or control, as it happens simply because conditions remain uneven. The same process repeats again and again. As water responds, balance shifts slightly, and movement continues. And this repetition does not lead to resolution or build toward an ending, but simply maintains a steady state of change. If you find that your attention moves away from the words, that is expected, because nothing important depends on staying focused, and the narration is designed to remain consistent, without demanding listening or asking to be followed. You may notice that the language itself begins to repeat, and this is intentional, as it mirrors the way the ocean returns to the same patterns, not because it must, but because nothing interrupts it. Movement continues without variation, without urgency, and without any direction that needs to be tracked. The water does not move toward a goal, and it does not complete a cycle and stop, but simply continues adjusting, moment by moment, over long spans of time. As the sound remains steady, the explanation becomes something that can stay at the edge of awareness, with no need to understand how each part connects or remember what came before. The movement does not become clearer with effort or more complete with attention, as it remains what it is, slow, continuous, and unchanged. As the words continue, they begin to matter less, not because they are unimportant, but because they no longer need to be held, as the idea of slow movement has already settled and does not need to be reinforced or explained again. The ocean currents remain as they have been described, quiet, gradual, and unconcerned with attention, moving without awareness, without intention, and without any direction that needs to be named. This steadiness does not change, improve, or fade, but simply continues. You may notice that the language becomes softer, less precise, and more repetitive, and this is not meant to clarify, but to make clarity unnecessary. The movement of water does not require understanding or benefit from being followed closely, as it exists in the same way that breathing exists, happening and repeating without instruction. If you are still listening, the words can pass through lightly, and if you are no longer listening, the sound can remain, as nothing is lost either way. The ocean does not change when it is ignored, and its movement does not pause when attention drifts, but continues responding to the same conditions, the same differences, and the same quiet imbalances. This repetition does not become dull, but stable, and stability does not ask for awareness. As the narration remains even, there is less reason to notice individual sentences. As the sound blends together, the ideas soften, and the need to follow dissolves. There is nothing new ahead and nothing unexpected, because the explanation has already unfolded as much as it needs to, and from here, the words exist only to accompany the silence that grows between them, as the movement described becomes background, neither advancing nor retreating, but simply remaining, while the narration continues in this quiet, unchanging way, and you are free to let it fade further and further from attention. As the sound continues, there is even less to follow, as the words no longer carry new information or ask to be understood, remaining only as a gentle presence. The movement described before continues in the same way, slow, unchanging, and independent of attention, with nothing needing to be added and nothing needing to be taken away, as the ocean currents remain exactly as they are, adjusting quietly, responding slowly, and maintaining balance without effort. There is no reason to stay awake for this, because the explanation does not develop further or progress toward an ending, but simply stays where it is. The words repeat, the ideas soften, and the space between them grows. You may notice that sentences begin to blur together, and that individual phrases become harder to separate. And this is expected, because the sound is no longer meant to be listened to closely, but but to remain in the background.
The movement continues whether it is heard or not, and the narration continues whether it is noticed or not. There is nothing to wait for, no final thought to hold, and no summary to remember, as everything that needed to be said has already been said. From here, the words exist only to support the quiet, without directing attention or requiring any response. The ocean continues adjusting to the same conditions, the same differences, and the same slow changes. And nothing about this process becomes urgent or reaches completion, as it simply continues as it always has. You do not need to remain present or listen further, because the sound will remain steady and the pacing will not change. And as attention fades, the narration can fade with it. There is no signal to mark the end and no transition to notice. Only the same quiet continuation, uninterrupted and unchanged, as you allow the words to dissolve into sound and the sound to dissolve into silence.